welcome once again to this latest episode of the WPC Inspiration Series. My name is Kylie Lyons and I am the CEO of the World Photographic Cup. And if you haven't watched any of our other inspiration series, go back and have a look. We are interviewing all our finalists from the 2025 edition, and there's some really great interviews and insights into some of our award-winning images. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel so that you can keep up to date when all our videos are released. And now, off to our latest interview. Welcome to this episode of the WPC Inspiration Series. If you haven't seen one of these episodes yet, this is where we are interviewing our 2025 finalists and talking about their winning image and, probing into their lives and who they are and what they do so that you get to meet them. And today we have a special guest from Australia, a colleague of mine. We're introducing Matt Palmer. Welcome, Matt, to the Inspiration Series.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Now, I'm not going to compare apples and oranges, but we have already spoken to your lovely wife. So how is it being a husband and wife team and being both photographers?
It's pretty much the best thing ever because a lot of photographers out there, especially landscape photographers in particular, they want to stop the car by the road and look at the light and wait for something to unravel in the landscape. And that can be taxing on relationships sometimes. And for our relationship, it's like, absolutely, I fully understand. And we both find something interesting, but then we also make space to go our separate ways as well.
Wonderful. Well, let's start at the beginning. Give me your elevator pitch. Who are you?
Well, I'm not so good with elevator pitches, but in terms of who I am, I used to be a designer. I got a bit bored of design, became a photographer, mainly because my design jobs needed photography. And then the more I did, the more I was just interested in that aspect of things. And I spent 15 years photographing live music. Then I became the creative director of a national sporting brand. And that was marrying both the photography and the design together, as well as a few other things. And then these days, a few jobs later, I just run a gallery in Bright in Victoria.
Excellent. So we should explain that Bright is about 3 hours north of Melbourne? Is that about right?
Yeah, about right. 4 hours.
Yeah, in snow country. A
Yeah,
lot of people
so we
don't
do get
realise.
snow. I think Mika covered that.
Correct. Excellent. Now, I have met Matt in the past. We have judged together on a number of occasions, and Matt has always been a very articulate and very considered judge. So if anyone out there is looking for an international judge, I'm just going to put your hand up, Matt. So, because if I do, I just want to share quickly your you've got two websites that I got up. This one is your gallery website, Alpine Light, which is alpinelight.com.au. Yep. And you obviously offer workshops and tours, and I was just scrolling all about you. You do have a real range of photographic genres that you cover, weddings and the live music and your commercial work and things, and landscape obviously is now your passion, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so I kind of describe it that I've photographed everything except for babies and galaxies. Pretty much everything else I've photographed at some point or another. Just for anyone listening, I don't currently shoot weddings and I'm not in a hurry to shoot anymore. Not that I'm damaged by it, but I think in photography you go through sort of phases. And for me personally, I like to work on projects. So I might spend a few years hyper focused on one thing and then maybe release a book or an exhibition or something like that. And then I say farewell to that. And I'm like, okay, what am I inspired by now?
Excellent. So, well, that's a little bit about you. And we did look briefly at the Alpine Light gallery website with Mika. I'm going to stop sharing that, and I want to share your website because you do have your own website as well, which is mattpalmer.co. And there's some amazing images again on here. It's obviously broken down into those projects that you were just mentioning. So I think this is your latest project, the Icelandic Echoes book.
Uh, I'm not sure if it's the latest project, but it's the one that has kind of resolved itself most recently, thanks to a third visit to Iceland. But I felt like there were a few gaps in the project, and I didn't really want to release the book knowing that those gaps existed. So I was fortunate enough to go back and go to some of the more obscure nooks of the country and find some interesting buildings as well.
And I recognize a number of these images that I'm just briefly scrolling through. You won a number of national awards here in Australia and international awards too. It's this one here, this The Last Light from 2022. I recognize that image immediately.
Oh, cool.
So have a look at Matt's website. Very worthwhile getting into. But what inspires you, Matt? What sort of gets your juices flowing?
There's a lot of things that inspire me. So, just as an example, one of my projects was Faces of Islam, and the inspiration behind that was people's general response or societal response to the Paris attacks many years ago. And so, as a response to that, I was like, well, I'm not very good at writing things or convincing people to think a different way online or whatever. So what can I do? And what I did do was document and photograph 40 different Muslims in Brisbane and interview them about their lives. And generally, I'll find something. I'm quite, I'd say, responsive as a photographer. So I take a lot of things in and then I respond to things. And once I've responded really strongly to something, that's kind of when I'll chase that down or follow that idea through and maybe develop it into something a bit fuller. These days, it's mainly landscape photography, as you mentioned, for the gallery, but also it's a great excuse to travel as well.
Mm.
And so, generally, for that, I've got the most ridiculous Google Earth probably database that you'd see. There's pins on nearly every country in the world of just interesting places. And I've kind of got a vague Michelin star system on my pins where it's like if you're in the country, then you definitely go here. If you're in a neighborhood, you'd go there, and so on. It's a bit tiered. So I kind of, in terms of travel, work off what the big things are going to be or the big opportunities, and then find the small things around that as well.
Wow. Now, you have not, this is not your first year, 2025 is not your first year entering World Photographic Cup. You have represented Team Australia in the past. Do you remember how many times?
I think maybe two other times. I think one was maybe in year 2 or 3. And so things were quite a bit different back then. The whole thing was still developing as a concept. And so I kind of found out sometime after the entry had happened, I'd consented to it through other processes. But then it wasn't until after the team and everything. So that was quite cool to be on something like really fresh and brand new back then. But then it's only become more and more professional and organized since then.
Mm. So let's share your image for 2025. So this was entered into the sports category.
Yeah. So that's Australian fighter John Wayne Parr who's landing that punch at the moment. And if I recall correctly, the other fighter was Johan Ledon, who I think was French. And for anyone that knows fighting, JWP or John Wayne Parr is one of the top fighters in Australian history, basically. It's had, I can't even tell you how many fights, but it's easily well over 100 and multiple, I think maybe 13 world championships or something like that. And he was also one of the first people, well, actually, I think the first Westerner to ever win the championship in, I think it's Lupini Stadium, if I can remember correctly. I'm a little bit disconnected from this project now, so some of those little details of what stadiums are called and things are a bit on the fringes of my memory. But yeah, he's definitely an Australian icon, so it was great to photograph him.
So this fight, and I know you've got a series of images, and again, we can see them on your website. Were these all in Australia, or did you travel to go and record these events?
I was lucky enough to shoot them all in Brisbane, so it was all very travelable. And I guess because it was such kind of like a niche sport, that you would have really world class talent come to somewhere like Brisbane. Whereas if maybe it was like boxing or something, you might only see it in capital cities rather than a capital city of a state instead. So yeah, even being in Brisbane, we could access some really high level talents.
When I've seen these images of yours, it does look like you understand the sport. Did you do a lot of research before you went in and just, poked your camera in the ring and started taking pictures?
Yes and no. So the very first time I did it, I intended it to be a standalone project that would just run for one night. And that was because my partner at the time had been doing some training with a fighter who was then going to fight for like the state championship. And I thought it'd be interesting just to document the process from before the fight itself, and then after the fight. And that would just be the standalone project. And he loved that idea. Of course, he loves that sort of attention. So he was very keen for that. And then just being there on the night, it was I ended up photographing two of his gym mates who were also fighting for titles, and so I just applied the project to them as well. Like, while I'm here, I'll do this. And after that, some promoters saw the market. We want you to come and photograph our shows as well. And so I kind of agreed to do that on the provision that I would basically have creative control. I wouldn't be shooting on commission, so I'm not there to take photos of the sponsor logos or walk around the tables taking photos of the guests or whatever. I just wanted to do my own thing, and if that worked for them, then it works for me. So that was a really good arrangement. In terms of the sport itself, though, you're completely right that the more you understand it, the better the photography can be. Some people will know about shutter lag and also your own personal reaction times. And you think about how fast it is that somebody would hit somebody else in a sport, or some really fast action, like it could be somebody photographing baseball, for example, and capturing the bat hitting the ball at the exact right time. You have to be pressing the button before it actually happens to capture it happening. And if you see it happen and then you press the button, well, you've already lost it. Like the whole action is already gone. So in some ways, you are anticipating all the strikes. And it's even trickier in this sport because they can use elbows, knees, legs. So you then start to read the fight and go, oh, well, maybe they're throwing a feint. And there's a lot of feints thrown, so they'll look like they're going to throw a punch. And so that's what you're expecting, but then they'll actually do something else. So the more you can read what's going on in the fight, the better the fighter actually is, because they want to be able to read all of that as well.
So,
But the better the photography will be too.
yeah, an image like this, I'm sure, the fighter would appreciate it so much because you have captured it at that split second when the fist is actually going into the stomach, so that us as the viewers can feel that impact, can probably feel the emotion and the tension and adrenaline that's happening at the time. Would you be shooting at, high frame rates and shooting multiple images and choosing the best one?
Yeah, I would generally burst through a shot, which might be, 4 to 6 images. I think back when I took this photo, I might have even been on like the Canon 5D Mark III. So a lot of people were saying that's not a good sports camera, and I managed to win Sports Photographer of the Year in Australia using that camera. So I'm like, actually, it's pretty good. There's a lot of even better cameras these days. Of course, you can shoot at like 20 to 30 frames a second and pretty much be shooting the equivalent of film in terms of how many captures a second you might be taking. But you also have to be cautious of using up your buffer as well. So if you're just, as I say, machine gunning through it or holding down the button and taking hundreds of frames, then something might happen that's really spectacular. But now your camera's loading all of those files onto the card, and you're having to wait while that happens, which would be a bit agonizing. So it's better to be as efficient as possible, but use the tools that are available as well.
And of course, then there's less images to actually, cull and edit at a later stage. Much like, when you're shooting weddings and you're coming home with cards of images, you don't need all that time spent in front of the computer.
Yeah.
But what did you actually do to this image to edit it, to get it to what we see here and get it into the World Photographic Cup competition?
Yeah, it's almost like borderline embarrassing in that regard, because when this series of images were a lot more publicly viewed, lots of people were asking about the processing, and it's just as simple as switch it to black and white, little bit of clarity and sharpness, and maybe radial gradient here or there, just to like pull down some light in certain areas where maybe it's not as vital. And that's about it. So a lot of the shots that I did in sports were edited in like 1 or 2 minutes.
Would you have presets loaded into Lightroom or whatever program you're using to make this an easy task for you?
To be honest, I don't use presets too often, but what I will do is if images are all shot within a very similar lighting kind of level and direction and things like that, then you can edit one photo to be perfect the way that you want it, and then batch that edit across the rest of the shoot. And it's kind of like you're just making your own preset on the spot.
Mm. With this kind of fighting, it looks like they're in a cage. Forgive me that I don't understand the whole nuances of it, but
Yeah.
how close are you? What are you doing? You sticking a lens through this cage, or you shooting so close to the cage that there is a little bit of cage you can see, but it's so far blurred that it's not taking away from the action that's happening?
Yeah, so in this particular sport, so this is on JWP's promotion, and he wanted to take the kind of cage that you would see in mixed martial arts and apply it to Muay Thai, which would traditionally use a ring instead, so your typical kind of boxing ring. So it's a bit of a hybrid of sports there. And in terms of photographing it, you're on the outside of the cage, and I want to be pretty close to the cage and generally shooting through a hole as much as possible. But of course, you can't fit the whole lens through that or the whole shot through that. And that's why you see those little spherical kind of flares around the edges. And that can be a problem if they're in the wrong place. But if they're kind of around the image, they actually can add a little bit of drama to it as well. It's almost like it's adding a little bit of creativity and artiness to what would otherwise be a fairly straight shot.
Now, in terms of it being selected to represent Team Australia, do you know what was the process you had to go through?
Well, for Team Australia, you can apply directly through their website. So if you have just a cracking image, maybe you're not somebody that enters awards all over the place, but you've got this really special image, then you can apply directly. And then the committee also has relationships with various competitions, so they can see and have an eye of what's going on in Australian photography as well. And then they might also tap some people on the shoulder if they see that they're producing some really high quality work that might be suitable.
So, as a team member, have you gained, you know, relationships with other team members? Have you met other international photographers or Australian photographers and been able to, liaise with them and talk with them about photography and grow that friendship?
That's a bit of a tricky one, because I feel like a lot of the people in Australia in particular that are involved in WPC were also involved in other organizations. So it feels like there's a bit of kind of like a national family of photographers that already exist. But certainly WPC comes up as a discussion topic. And I think when the winners and the placements are read out in March, I believe it is, we will probably have like a big chat going on Facebook or something like that where everyone can celebrate. And we usually invite some of the New Zealanders into that as well. So there's a bit of camaraderie there, as well as a competition. But I think for Australian photographers and New Zealand photographers in particular, we're all about celebrating each other's wins rather than, fighting or competing with each other. So as much as I don't think he managed to be a finalist, but Andy Chung is one of our Australian representatives in sports, and I just think his work is fantastic. And I actually really love the image that he had submitted in this year. The tennis photo of, I think it was a butterfly or a moth on, oh, I can't remember his name now, but just amazing photographs. So, if I hadn't gotten the finalist and one of the other two guys had have gotten in, then I'd be just as happy as I am now.
It's the luck of the draw, I guess. We both know we've entered competitions over the years, we've judged them over the years. But if there's people watching this video and they're thinking about entering a competition, it wouldn't matter if it's something like World Photographic Cup or if it's a local competition to them. Do you have any advice that you could give?
Yeah, well, there's lots of advice. Firstly, make sure you read the terms and conditions and all of that kind of boring stuff. But you don't want to be disqualified for some silly little reason when actually you had a really great photo. But in terms of the creative side of things, I would say think about the judges as people that might be viewing 1,000 photos in a day, and what's going to be the photo that makes them stop for a moment and go, oh, okay, this is not something that I've seen today or possibly ever. And having that thing that's just a little bit different, that will never hurt your chances, I don't think.
I think that's sage advice because every competition has their own T's and C's and they're all different for different reasons. So you've got to make sure that you do actually qualify for the category that you're entering. So appreciate that information. But what about in terms of tips and tricks? I like to end our little interviews with a tip or a trick or a piece of advice that you could give anyone about photography, whether it is actually capturing or processing or a life lesson. Give us your tip, Matt.
Well, can I give you maybe two tips, if that's all right?
Sure, I think
So
that's fine.
one will be a bit dry, and then the other one's a bit more broad. So the first one would be quite relevant to the photograph that you've seen, and that is when I shoot documentary style work where I don't have control over the environment or the lighting itself, then I'll typically shoot in raw monochrome. And that's because I can directly see how the light's relating to the image and the balance of the light really easily. Whereas in something like concert photography, for example, you might have really strong red lights or blue lights, and you're thinking, oh, my photo is even overexposed because all of those reds or blues or those colors are kind of blocking up and losing detail. But then if you take that same photo and then convert it to black and white, you actually find that it's underexposed and it's just that one channel that's really playing up. So by removing all of that while you're shooting, you're making the most accurate decisions about where your exposure should sit. So I think that's a good one for anyone that's kind of shooting sports or music, performing arts, that kind of thing. It can be really helpful. Of course, you want to shoot raw so that you don't get stuck with those black and whites if you actually need the color later on. And then I guess the other thing I was going to say is in terms of personal voice. So you always hear photographers going, "Oh, I need to find my voice or my creative, what my creative style is." And I would say, like for example, this project it had a very consistent creative style. But I'd say if you shoot a lot, that will come to you. You don't have to really look for it. It's just the process of shooting a lot and shooting things that you really like in a way that you like. And then before you know it, people will be coming up to you and going, "Oh, I thought that was one of your photos. That looks like a matte picture or whoever." So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just do your thing and it will happen.
Yeah, your style will come.
Hmm.
Well, Matt, you have been very generous with your time and your knowledge today. So I'd like to thank you for being part of our WPC Inspiration Series. For those who've been able to watch today, remember to like and subscribe. And every time our videos are released, you'll get notification. And if you want to reach out to Matt, I'm sure you wouldn't mind, Matt, if anyone wanted to contact you, but I'll put your social media information and all your website details in the description of this video. So, Matthew Palmer, Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.